Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really excited. We are getting to introduce you to a new author, and even better for us, a new author who lives in Arizona in Flagstaff. So welcome, Ash Davidson.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, that's kind of you to say that. And we do have an audience tonight. We have an audience called T.J. Newman, the author of Falling. And at some point, Tori's going to come up and chat with us for a few minutes because those of you who watched her event on July 6th were totally frustrated by the whistling sound that came from our broken air conditioning duct. So we're going to revisit Tori and give you a chance to hear what she has to say. Anyway, Ash, congratulations. This book has had more reviews than, well, maybe Tori beat you, but I don't think so. I think it was about a time. And I noticed that you were the cover for the New York Times book review on Sunday. A wonderful review of Damnation Spring.
Thank you. I've been very fortunate, but I think I should be clear that if we're tallying reviews, Tori very clearly wins.
Okay. Both of you have had significant media coverage, shall I put it that way? It'd be a lot more tactful. Okay. And I mean, how exciting for us, because Tori also lives in Arizona, so I mean, it's really, in 30 years, I can't remember that we have had two debut authors from Arizona who visited the Poison Pen. Can you, Patrick? Do you think we've... Patrick's
Probably, but I can't remember.
It's so exciting.
Yeah,
I love it.
super
New
exciting.
And local talent even. Wonderful. So Ash, I think your cover is magnificent, and it really expresses the feeling for your book. Did you have any input into this gorgeous cover?
This beautiful cover is entirely the work of the art and design team at Scribner Books. The painting is by a painter named Jeremy Miranda, who I'd highly recommend following on Instagram. His work is beautiful. And the painting wasn't done for the book explicitly. The designer, J.M. Misselli, tracked it down and figured out exactly how to fit the title on it. And it's just, I think it beautifully captures sort of the spirit of the place where the book is set. And so I was so fortunate that someone had painted it before, like, to match the book, even though we didn't know each other.
Well, it is fortunate. It's also fortunate they agreed to let you use it. It's a licensing requirement. But nonetheless, it's a beautiful book. And as we talk about it, you will find out that the book takes place in forest, an old forest. And I have to say, Tori, this book, I'm sorry, Tori, you're over here, Ash. Really made me nostalgic because when I was an undergraduate, we used to go up to Mount Tamalpais in the area, your woods, around north of San Francisco where the redwoods are, and over to Yosemite. And when I was a child, my father, we took a couple of trips driving down the whole Oregon coast where the redwoods were so beautiful. Those huge log trucks would thunder down Highway 1 and people in little cars were panicking, because you thought, what if we get caught between these huge, enormous log trucks? So this is the community that you have chosen to write about. What attracted you to it?
So the book is set in Klamath, California, on the far northern coast of California, just shy of the Oregon line, near the mouth of the Klamath River. And I chose that community because my family had lived there when I was a young child. We left when I was 3, but I grew up listening to my parents' stories of the place and the people, and so those stories became a kind of mythology of my childhood. And there's a lovely quote in Memory Wall by Anthony Doerr where he says, more or less, like, we bury pieces of our childhood here and there, and they wait there our whole lives for us to come back and dig them up. And that was just a piece of my childhood that was always waiting for me.
That's beautifully put. So Rich Gunderson, you are writing about Rich and his family, and they are embedded in the logging community. And Rich in particular has his eye on one giant sequoia. It's been like his goal forever to create as much lumber as he could out of this one tree.
Yes, Rich Gunderson is a very tall logger, obsessed with a very tall tree called the 24/7 tree. It's a tree that's wide enough to drive a car through, it's taller than the Statue of Liberty, and he's inherited sort of a family obsession with owning it and harvesting it. And he finally sees his chance and he takes it. He buys the plot of land the tree is on and several hundred trees around it. But he doesn't tell his wife, Colleen, who's a homemaker and a midwife in the community, and she has this encounter with an old flame who sort of plants the idea in her mind that some of the anomalies that she's witnessed midwifing, and maybe even her own miscarriages, might be related to herbicides that the logging company her husband works for uses. And that's really upsetting for her personally because she's been desperately trying to have a second child. And it's a suspicion that becomes pretty corrosive for their marriage. You know, it opens up a real rift between them, it threatens to ruin the couple financially, and it also exposes all these fault lines underlying the community and even her own family.
It's hard to be in a community that basically is fading away. I mean, I think about coal miners in, West Virginia, and how hard it would be if you had generations of a family who, whose trade was mining, and yet coal's being phased out. And I think in today's atmosphere, the book is set, what, in 1977? Do I have that right? Okay. If you were writing about it in today's terms, do you think more people would be sympathetic with the tree than with Rich?
That's a really good question. I think it's a book about one industry logging in one small town in Northern California, but as you say, it could very easily be set in a dozen different industries in 100 small towns across this country, whether it's coal mining in West Virginia or oil and gas in Wyoming or uranium mining in the Southwest. And I think that I wanted to set it in that time period because I think it gives us a sense of remove from today, but I think that a lot of the issues are perennial and you would find them today in those communities. A lot of the concerns that Rich and his colleagues on his logging crew have. And I also think that I work for a conservation organization, so I'm the definition of what Rich would call a tree hugger. And I think that in the conservation community and also as a nation, we have sort of an unfortunate tendency to blame people who work in extractive industry as if you've somehow signed up for whatever, health issues might come along with your profession, like you knew what you were getting into. And I think that is really dehumanizing for people who do that work. And I really wanted to spend some time thinking about how much pride there is in work, no matter what work you're doing, and also just the reality that the needs of the planet and the needs of the market are sometimes at odds, and it's easy to sit on your sofa and judge someone for cutting down a redwood tree, but you're perhaps living in a house made of wood and you have a deck made of redwood, and there's someone who sweated and bled so that you could have a nice set of patio furniture. And I think that sort of disconnect is interesting, and I think that at the core there are shared fundamental human values that we, I think, have as human beings can recognize in another human being, regardless of where you stand on issues of environmental regulation, regardless of what you think of old growth forests, whether they should be protected and preserved or harvested and put to good commercial use.
Well, there's that environmental issue, but in a broader sense, I think we're talking today just as much as in 1977 at people who are in industries that are dying out. I mean, we've had many authors here talking about the newspaper industry, for example. I grew up in Chicago, and I remember the steel mills in Gary, Indiana, and how enormous they were, and they died out. One of the things we've learned in the pandemic is that the global supply chain that many industries have relied on, where some of the extracted products or manufactured products are coming from a huge distance, are not reliable at this point. Do we really want our pharmaceuticals made in China? Remember the whole baby powder, the milk for babies, the contamination issue in China. So it isn't really just about nature and trees. And I think a lot of the discontent that we're seeing in our society today is between those people whose livings and professions have been endangered or phasing out, and people who, in the tech industry, let's say, whose professions are, more glamorous and also are hiring. So, I mean, you're a writer, so, you know, theoretically, you're not affected by all that, but if you go back and look at the life of writers and how they were paid, if you go back and look at, you know, St. Paul's Churchyard, where, you know, publishers sold books out of their shop and hired writers out the back, and writers had no copyright protection. It was a totally perilous industry. I think that's just the way of the world. And it's always been this way with societies, that, you know, various products create demand. I mean, look at fashion. I mean, I love the fact that ostriches, for example, were an endangered species at the turn of the 20th century because women wore ostrich feathers all the time. Or look at the beaver, you know. I mean, so fashion has much to answer for, and you're right, there's a tremendous disconnect between people parading around in furs or feathers or whatever, and the people who make them and how we feel about them. Should they, in fact, be criticized, or should opprobrium attached to them? You know, I think that as Amazon forest is maybe the hottest topic of this at the moment, where, you know, it's being burned for agriculture, or trees are being cut down, it's releasing all sorts of bad things into the atmosphere, and yet the people living there are starving. So, you know, what do you do? I mean, as a conservationist, have you looked at this in a more global setting?
I mean, I think what's interesting about extracting natural resources, whether it's cutting down old growth redwoods or killing beaver across the West, I think as a species we're not terribly good at projecting ourselves very far ahead of where we are, and I think sometimes we don't realize the long-term impacts of an action, like thinking about wetlands and water in the West and the integral role that beaver were actually playing in that, which I don't think really occurred to people until they were gone. And I think in the area where the book is set, even today, the highway along the coast in Northern California, very near, just north of Klamath, there's a large mudslide, and the road is closed most of the day because of the landslide, and that same landslide is in this book in the 70s, and here we are almost 50 years later, and that same landslide is endangering that road. And so I think whether you look at a micro level in Klamath, California, or you look at the Amazon, I think trying to think not just a year ahead or 10 years ahead, but several generations ahead is not always our strong suit as a species.
I think you're right. Well, now we've talked about issues, let's talk about story, because after all, this is not nonfiction, nor is it some sort of treatise for conservation. It's a really powerful story about a family. So, you know, how did you imagine these characters into being?
So, I think Divination Spring is really a story about family and about love and about greed, and what happens to a family and a community when this way of life that sustained them for generations begins to literally erode under their feet. And so I did invent these characters, but after working on this book for 10 years, I feel more like I met them, which I realize makes me sound completely insane. But
no, it makes you sound like most authors we talk to, so don't panic.
Okay. So I started with Rich Gunderson, who's in his early 50s when the book opens, and for 2 years it was just him in his voice, in a first-person voice. And he's an honorable man. He's very devoted to his family. He does the right thing even when no one else will. And he's also very quiet and reserved, which is challenging as a character because he won't always say what he thinks. And so you have to sort of derive it from his gesture, what he doesn't say, from his body language. And so after about 2 years, I added his wife, Colleen, who's significantly his junior, who can walk into many rooms that Rich just can't walk into, literally and figuratively. You know, he can't walk into the kitchens of women in the community and sit down at the table and find out what's really on their minds and on their hearts. And he can't walk into a woman's bedroom when she's in labor and help her deliver a baby just because of the social constraints in that area at that time. And so I added Colleen, who is very devoted to her family, very devoted to her sister Enid, who has 6 children, and is sort of like it's really a sister life of what Colleen would kind of like for herself, but it's a very chaotic version of the life Colleen has. Colleen is also very quiet, and so after several more years, I added their son Chubb, who's 5 when the book opens, and 5 is a great age. I'd been a nanny, so I had some experience with kids that age, and it was just such a joy and a relief in some ways to be in Chubb's company, because he's literally much lower to the ground than his parents, so he notices things in the natural world, and also I think that Chubb, like many children, is not always given the credit for being as perceptive as he is. And I think as adults will often say things in front of children thinking, oh, they won't understand that. And kids pick up on a lot more than we give them credit for. And even if they can't always parse exactly the meaning of what's being said, they can sort of they can tell the emotional temperature of the room, and they can reveal a lot. And so Chubb is, I think, a wonderful stand-in for the reader in many cases, because he can enter a room and be a set of eyes without judgment and without filtering, and he just sort of presents the information as a reader, and then as an adult reader you can sort of piece together the pieces that he knows that these fit, but he's not sure exactly what they mean.
When you started out with Rich, did you write him in first person so that everything was filtered through him, or did you always write the third person looking at Rich?
It was in the first person when I started.
It might be, right?
My now agent, Chris Paris-Lamb, when I first met him, I was several years into writing the book, and he said, I think you should really write in the third person. And I had been through sort of a prolonged sort of trough of doubt, and I was just sort of starting to rebuild my confidence in myself. So I said, don't tell me what to do. And then several years later, I moved the book to the third person. And several years after that, I wrote a very contrite email saying, I don't know if you remember me, but you were right. This needed to be in the third person. Would you look at it? And because Chris is an infinitely generous and gracious person, he did look.
Well, that was very kind of him. I mean, it sounded from what you'd said that when you were just in Rich's company, you would have been writing it through his point of view for a first person. But then if he is quiet, you had a lot of challenges, one of which is that he's quiet and reserved. And then you brought in another person who was also quiet and reserved. And so, to do that, you had to move to third person. But then I think you're right about Chubb, is that he is the emotional, in many ways, the emotional heart of the story.
I think he is. And I also added a few loudmouth side characters who I realized were much more fun to write, because they're much more vocal about what they think and a little bit more dramatic in their actions, and I think they add some color and some texture to the book. But I think you're right, that Chubb really is the emotional heart of a book that's very much about a family and the love inside that family.
So those of you who are watching that think that books sort of spring like, Athena from the brow of Job or whatever, or that a book is always the book that it emerges from the beginning, it's interesting to hear Ash tell us how this book has evolved over time, both in characters and in... Was the story always roughly there? I mean, did you change the story dramatically, or did it change when you began to add new characters to it? What was your original focus for the book?
So the book is set over the course of 1 year, from the summer of 1977 to the summer of 1978, and it's broken up by seasons. But the first draft that I wrote took place over 2 or 3 days. And so the plot of the novel changed a lot in the course of writing, and I worked on the book for 10 years. And I have a Word document that it's broken up into several Word documents, but I have about 500,000 words that didn't make it in. And so, I think I wrote a lot more than I needed, and then it gradually got winnowed down. And so I think that it did change quite a bit from the first draft, but I went through a number of drafts. Not as many as Tori, but many.
But many. I think there's a really decent chance that this book could win a Pulitzer. It's been discussed as a great American novel, and I think it does touch on issues that are often not dealt with in fiction, but can be maybe even better dealt with in fiction. Sometimes I think you can, use your voice and the voice of your characters to illustrate things that if you were trying to write it as a thesis or nonfiction wouldn't be nearly so engrossing. But, I think critics have said many of those things. I'm just parroting a lot of better reviewers than I am, but I think that, why do you think, that'd be a better question, why do you think that this book has had such an awesome reception?
I've been very fortunate. Reviewers have been very generous to the book, and I don't know if I can answer that question. I think that the book started for me with a very personal question about wanting to know. My family, when we lived in Klamath, we relied on a creek behind the house for drinking water. My parents were really concerned about herbicide sprays that the logging company was using, and they left in the mid-'80s, and so they didn't remember much about the herbicides. So when I went back initially, I was really looking for a book about herbicide use in this area, and it didn't exist that I could find. And so I decided that I would write it. And perhaps because I'm a fiction writer, but I think also because I think something that I take from fiction as a reader and something that draws me to fiction as a writer is that fiction really demands a lot of empathy on the part of the person reading. And I think that good books challenge you as a reader to put yourself in someone else's shoes and experience their life. And I think that's why I was drawn to this subject matter in this place, because I didn't grow up here. We left when I was 3, but I feel in a sense that all the places you live in your life, maybe there's some version of you that if you had stayed there, where would your life have gone, And so I think I was always curious about that, and this was an opportunity to go back and explore. And I very quickly realized when I went back on research trips that if I was going to write about a family deeply rooted in this community, the odds are that they would work in the logging industry, because that is what drove the economy in that part of the country.
Well, you really answered my next question, which is why did you choose to write it as fiction rather than nonfiction? It's a beautiful answer. Wow. Right, Sarah Tori, why don't you come and join us? Because many of the things we've just talked about apply to you too. What do we want to do here? Move a chair?
Sure.
Maybe move the furniture here? Sure. Why don't you sit where I am and I'll sit over here so you'll be closer to Ash.
Sure, okay.
All right?
We're masked specifically to match your book.
Right, so you can hold up your book there, take off your mask, there we go. Really thinking about what she said, Tori, so many of those things also apply to you. Because the journey to you to publish Falling for you was a long one. Why don't you, for those of you who didn't have a chance to hear our discussion in July for various reasons, why don't you tell us about your journey towards publication?
Yeah, it was similar in a way. I was just sitting over there listening to Ash and just mentally taking notes and being it's just so fascinating to see how similar journeys are and how different journeys are. And like you alluded to, I wrote over 30 different drafts of this book before it came to be what it is. I don't have a document with 500,000 words that are left behind. I think I deleted all the ones that were bad and just filled it up with new ones. But it was a long, winding process of trying to figure out how to tell the right stories with the right people. Like you were saying too, you write some things. I wrote it always in the point of view that I did, but it's a fascinating process to see. Like you said, books aren't just, oh, I have an idea, I'll start on chapter 1 and just go straight through. It's a very non-linear process.
So you could, I mean, you wrote out of your career as a, fine, thank you. I was going to say stewardess, and I thought, that's so dating me. Sounds like Pan Am or something. I've got to go, flight attendant, right? So, you know, the story, well, tell the story, because it's a wonderful story, how you started writing it.
Yeah, I started, well, I had the idea for the book on the plane, sort of the elevator pitch, I guess, is that it's a story of Flight 416, a flight from Los Angeles to New York, and what the passengers don't know is that their family, the family of their pilot, Captain Bill Hoffman, has been kidnapped. And he has been told that if he doesn't crash the plane, they will be killed. And so then it follows, you know, the path of the crew and the passengers in the air and the family and the FBI on the ground in their, you know, attempts to do the impossible. And I had the idea for the book at work on a red-eye. I was working a flight and I was standing at the front of the cabin looking out at the passengers. It was red-eye and they were asleep. And I had this passing thought that their lives and my life and all of our lives are in the hands of the pilots. And for the first time I thought, how vulnerable, that much power, that much responsibility, how vulnerable does that make the pilots? And I couldn't shake the thought. And so a few days later, I was working a different trip with a different set of pilots, and I just said to the captain that I was flying with, what if, you know, hey, what would you do if, you know, your family was kidnapped and you were told that if you didn't crash the plane, they would be killed? What would you do?
You got an instant answer.
The instant answer was, there's your book. Like, there's a story there, because he didn't have an answer. And as soon as I realized there wasn't an answer to that question that you could just reference in the manual, I knew there was a story that I had to figure out and that I had to write.
So, in your case, you were always going to have to write it in third person because you have multiple characters.
Right.
But did you feel, as Ash has so eloquently said, that, you know, this was a story you needed to tell as part of your own life? I mean, you know, reliving some of your career?
Yeah, I think so. You know, it's in reading Damnation Springs, it's this immersive experience into a world that most of us don't have any exposure to. I personally, I don't live in that kind of community. I'm not a old growth, you know, logger. It is a world that is completely foreign to me. So being with these characters in this world that is so rich and so detailed is just, I mean, a real glimpse into a life that I've had no exposure to and just know really nothing about. And it's fascinating. Falling's a little bit different, but in a kind of similar way, in that it's a world that everybody has a connection to. Like, everybody has a connection to aviation one way or another. Even if you've never been on a plane, that is a story. That's a connection to aviation. You know, we look up in the sky and we see planes flying by. You know, it's a world that we all have some sort of connection and experience to, but is also very detailed and specific, and something like their world that if you're not in it, sort of on like the behind the scenes aspect, if you're not in it, it can be hard to understand. If I was to write a story about this world, having no understanding, it would be awful. That's why you wrote this brilliant book, because you get it. It's just, yeah. So that was with Falling. Yeah, it was just kind of giving a glimpse into a world that is very detailed and specific and
So I have to tell you that last night when we launched Preston and Child in their new book, Bloodless, you came up because the book begins with D.B. Cooper and his hijacking of the Boeing airplane. And we talked about the fact, because it was 1971, which is the same time that Ash's book, 77 for Ash, that anybody who was in an airplane being hijacked, as Doug said, thought that what they were going to get is like 2 days in Havana, a little sun, and then they'd all be flown home. And that the pilot and the people on the flight attendants and all were trained just like people work in banks, just it's just the money. And, so let's be calm and let's, let the plane be hijacked. We'll pay the ransom. Everybody will have had just a little sun time and we'll go on. And then after 9/11, you could never think ever again about a plane being hijacked as they did in 1971.
Yeah.
And, it was sort of what I was talking to Ash about, that in 1977, cutting down a gorgeous sequoia wouldn't have been the same as if you were approaching it today, because our thinking has changed some, our resources now. So anyway, I thought you'd enjoy that, but it's really true that I think you probably couldn't have written this book in 1971.
No, and when I was my mom was a flight attendant, and she flew for TWA way back when, and when I was doing research for this book and writing this book, I had her manuals out, her old manuals, her paper manuals, and it was on the chapter in how to handle a hijacking. It was fascinating to see the differences. And I alluded to it briefly in Falling, but the protocol used to be just do whatever you gotta do to get them to not do this. And the main tactic was empathy. So, if you had pictures of your children or your pets or something in your badge, so that you could start up a conversation with them and say, oh, this is my son, and he's this, and then there'll be the theory is that they'll be less likely to follow through with their plan, which is not what we're taught anymore. But it is fascinating to see, how things change. And it's so fascinating reading Damnation Spring, which I have to, full disclosure, I have not finished yet, because it is so no spoilers, it's a beast of a book, and I am luxuriating in it. It is like every time you pick it up and read it, you just get so fully immersed in this world. And I don't know, maybe it's being in Phoenix in the middle of the summer, I'm just like desperate for the wet forest that is being, it is absolutely delicious to live in that world. But it's a fascinating juxtaposition where it's set in 1977, right? Mm-hmm. It feels so relevant too. It feels so, like, I forget sometimes that it's set then. I don't know, there's just very strange relevancy to it.
The issues I think are the same. Unlike, there's a much greater divide between 1971 and 2021 in terms of
the world of aviation.
Yeah.
But in this world,
Right, and I mean, I think people all over this country are part of the reason there's been this populist movement and so forth is because people are being left behind. The jobs that they valued and jobs where they could support their families for one reason or another, whether it's extraction or whether it's, some other skill, like in the newspaper industry where they're hiring fewer people, whatever. There's a huge fear in publishing that ebooks was going to decimate print books, and it's turned out not to be the case. They've stabilized at something like 20 or 25%, and audiobooks have actually, I think, taken up a larger. But every time there's a new technology, there's a fear in that people who did the old way to do business, whatever it was, are being bypassed. It's what happened to. And the other thing I think is so important is that the more you outsource all these things as a nation, the more vulnerable you are to everything else in the world. I mean, the British did that. They were the company that really started the Industrial Revolution. And then gradually, they began to outsource everything. And they also brought in people to do things. I mean, the reason there's a Pakistani population in England is because the people in England who got more money didn't want to work in the mills anymore. And, it's just a constant economic cycle. So I think that Ash's book speaks to us today just as well. I mean, did you did 71 because why? I know you sort of said that, but remind us, why did you pick 1971?
I ended up choosing the period I did for a very practical reason, which that there's a point in the plot that has to do with the timeline of the expansion of the national park in the Redwoods. That is key. I won't spoil it, but
No.
it's key to the plot. So
Okay.
I had it set a few years later, and then I realized that's not going to work, and I had to back up. But if I may, I will say that having finished Falling, I don't think I'll ever get on a plane without it crossing my mind for the rest of my life, which I think is like a testament to your work, but also like slightly terrifying for me personally. But I thought what was so interesting about it was it's a book I think that could only be written by someone who had that professional experience. And I think the element I most enjoyed in it, and in many of the interviews you've given, has to do with the fact that a flight attendant is not there to serve drinks, and I think that, like, naively, as a passenger, that is sort of the most immediate thing that you see, and so it's been really illuminating to learn, to sort of get that peek behind the curtain and realize why flight attendants are there, what they're trained to do, and I think that I will never look at another flight attendant the same way, too. I will now be much more intimidated by them, and I particularly love I hope this isn't a spoiler, I don't think it is, but there's a moment in the book where the flight attendant is commenting on the fact that the flight attendant's very aware that whenever there's some sort of disturbance, everyone looks at the flight attendant, and that there's this sort of mask that comes down, and I'm definitely one of those people where as soon as there's any turbulence, I'm like, does that person look worried? No, then we're fine. We're not gonna die. And so now, like, I feel like there's a whole sort of, like, I have another set of glasses that I can put on when I'm on a plane, and that's thanks to that book. I'll also be like gripping the sides of the seat.
Well, I appreciate that, and it's I think that's great. You said, I didn't realize. It's like, honestly, that's fantastic. If you don't know that we're there to do something besides serve drinks, that's honestly terrific, because that means we're not doing our jobs. Nothing's gone haywire, and we're not having to break out, the defibrillator or deal with some sort of security issue, and that's great. So it's been fun to sort of bring that awareness out. In the same way that reading Damnation Springs, I'm not sure someone, because Grand Canyon Land Trust, right? That's who you work for?
Grand Canyon Trust.
Grand Canyon Trust, right. I'm not sure that this subject matter and the way that what this story deals with could be told as well by someone who wasn't on the tree hugger side of it. Do you see what I'm saying? Because there's a certain non-judgment. You spoke about it earlier. Non-judgment to this world of like when you just think of chopping down old growth redwood, it does make you go, what? Oh gosh, what? And I think that the characters in this world is portrayed so respectfully and beautifully that I'm not sure that sort of, I think your viewpoint coming from your life experience has got to have just enriched that and made that. I appreciate that as a reader, that viewpoint, so thank you for that.
Can I ask an insider question? I want to know, is the tactic of duct taping people to their seats in the manual?
Listen, I was just going to bring that up because that picture of that passenger on whatever flight it was with the duct tape all wound around the seat, and I thought, okay, it must have been flight attendants, but maybe they also had to draft a passenger or two to help them.
Well, I'm sure they did. It was, I'm sure, a difficult.
It have to be a group effort. You have to hold the guy down while you're wrapping him up.
Right.
Or was it a woman? Was it a guy?
It was a man.
It was a guy.
It was a man. That's a perfect example of like, look, there are procedures, there are black and white rules, there are things that are in place steps that are in place, that we are to follow. But like most things in the world, we're going to hit a world of gray and go, outside. We're going to color outside the lines very quickly. I wasn't on that flight. I was not a member of that crew, so I'm not going to pass judgment on anything that they did. We're definitely not taught that in training. We're actually taught the opposite of that, from the standpoint of that you're never supposed to, even if you do use the flex cuffs and you are restraining a passenger, you're never supposed to. The reason that if they do. You're not supposed to tie someone to something secured to the plane in case we do need to evacuate the aircraft, because then how can the guy that's duct taped to the seat evacuate an aircraft if he's duct taped to a seat?
I think probably the feeling was nobody cared.
I was just impressed at that quantity of duct tape.
Yeah,
was
me
available.
too. And that it was on the flight, and you had to ask yourself, was it a passenger who had duct tape in a briefcase, or is the plane now equipped with duct tape? But this brings me to a point I meant to bring out about Ash's book, is that how much you learned about it being a midwife, because it's easy to think that all babies are born in hospitals, and we live in an urban area where probably the majority of babies are in fact born in hospitals or other medical facilities. But I thought, how did you learn so much about midwifery, Ash, to write your book?
A lot of YouTube videos.
Yeah.
And a huge gratitude to people who have shared birthing videos, and especially with commentary. And I'm not terribly strong stomached, and so there were certainly, I would start out sitting at the desk watching, and then I would sort of sit down on the floor, and then I would lie down on the floor. And so it was a very similar method to, like, I've never butchered a deer, and there's a hunting scene in the book where Rich and his brother-in-law harvest a deer, and that was another instance where I owe a great debt to YouTube. I'm sort of on the fence of whether I want, I was really curious about the sensory details that you can't get in video, like smell and texture, and some of those I relied on reading and interviewing people who'd had those experiences, and so I don't know that I really want a feature on YouTube where you can turn the scent on, but I was curious about that, and I definitely ended up at the end of the deer butchering video adventure, lying on the floor in the bedroom, looking through my eyes like this through my fingers, because I was just. But it was very helpful to actually see it, and I think we're so fortunate to be writing in this time when you don't, you have access to so many people who often just out of altruism have shared this experience and will explain to you in a very detailed way everything from how to deliver a baby or butcher a deer to how to fix your garage door opener. And I'm, as a human being and as a writer, I'm very grateful for sort of the altruism of the YouTube community.
I wondered if you had watched Call the Midwife, because virtually everything I know about midwifery I have gained from watching 3 seasons of Call the Midwife. Because it's not as, actually it's making a comeback in that more people are having home births and so forth, but for somebody of my generation it wouldn't have even occurred to you, to do that unless you were in some perhaps rural area or something. So again, it's interesting how society keeps pivoting, isn't it? And things that we value disappear and then they come back, or it's I think it's all completely fascinating. So you are writing in one sense historical fiction, but on the other hand, the story is also said. Your book is so contemporary that even though it's set in the 70s, it feels very much as though it were today. Patrick, why don't we turn to questions? Do we have any?
Don't really have any questions.
We've
surprisingly,
yeah. Incredible erudition, Elan, huh?
Right. I mean, the obvious questions for both of you is what are you working on now? How do you?
You first.
Me first. Well, it was a nice break in writing to come do this tonight, so that was really nice. I feel like I'm back to being just holed up in my place, just writing every day. But
splashing down here through the storm.
Yeah, exactly. It's in Phoenix. We're having a monsoon season. I can't remember the last time we had a monsoon.
I can't remember a day in August when I walked outside and it was 73 degrees and cooling. I can't ever remember.
It's unbelievable.
It's been, if you look at Seattle and you look at Phoenix and you think somehow there was this weird city reversal, because it's so
wet, and during the day, usually it's around sunset, and then in the night we'll get a storm, but it's been raining all day long today. It's just weird.
very cool.
Yeah, and cool. How's it been in Flagstaff? Because Ash lives 2 hours north in
You've
Flagstaff.
had some serious storms up north.
We have a lot of rain, and driving down here today, the hills were so green. You thought you were in Ireland. It doesn't look like
Arizona.
Arizona normally looks. It's quite spectacular.
Well, the climate is so different. For those who don't know, Arizona, Flagstaff is several thousand feet higher. What is it, 7?
About 7,000.
So it's like Santa Fe, but it's up above the Mogollon Rim in very, very different in the geology and in the climate and so forth than Phoenix. So, and it's only a 2-hour drive. It's not even that. So it's interesting how you can travel, you know, in a short time. You can travel through such a different world. But anyway,
Yeah.
back to what you were writing.
But I am writing, and that's all I'm going to say about that. I am writing.
Okay.
I found that for me at least, it's like I don't like to, and I definitely did this with Falling, in that I didn't tell people what I was writing, because as soon as you tell people what you're writing, then their reaction and their opinions and their ideas about it just start going on to it, so I like to keep it very, very tight-lipped when I'm
Okay.
working on something. So
That seems to be like the common and smart strategy among writers, and I think because I'm such a novice, for some reason, I'm not shy about saying what I'm working on, which I feel like someone should come back and remind me, you should not have done that. But I feel like I'm such a slow writer, it's going to be 8 or 9 years before it's out anyway, and by then everyone will have forgotten, so it doesn't matter. So I'm working on a novel that's set in a family that works in wildland firefighting. So it's a book about fire and about forests, but in a very different way than this book. And it's set largely in pine forests rather than the redwoods of Damnation Springs. So even though writing is a very indoor activity for me, if I'm writing about being outside in nature, I feel like I'm outside for those 3 hours that I get up and write before work every day. So
Well,
I'm writing a book about fire.
A very, pardon the pun, hot topic, and one that you can research. You can research it virtually every day. The way this year has gone, it's been so strange. Well, for those of you watching and those of you who may watch, and please refer friends who might have not been able to join us right tonight to either the podcast or the video of this. How spectacular this is that we have 2 new writers, 2 debut books, 2 Arizona authors, and we didn't mention, from the same publisher. I mean, it's really been an astonishing thing to have you both here, and in the same summer, even better. So all kinds of firsts here tonight. Very exciting for us. Thank you both very much for coming and joining us. I didn't mention also that Ash's book is our notable new fiction book of the month for August. Tori was our first mystery book of the month for July. So we've stamped a little imprimatur for the Poison Pen on their, for what that's worth, on their books. Anyway, thanks so much, everybody. Good night. Good night, ladies. Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.